I'm Monica Youn, and I'm a Constitutional Fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. I think that the term principle is perhaps problematic there. I think that the Supreme Court, in all sincerity, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, in all honesty, in all sincerity, believes that the First Amendment requires it to do what it is currently doing. I think that we're talking about a level of ideology. We're talking about, an ideological disagreement, but just because something is ideological doesn't mean it is not principled. I think the principled reason for the Supreme Court not to engage in this kind of constitutionalizing of campaign finance is that they don't know what they're doing. Politics is an area where there are always going to be speech values on either side. There's no, there are First Amendment rights, certainly, of individual spenders, of entities, of groups, of associations, and there are also First Amendment rights of voters, of participants, of listeners, of the audience. And there's no clear First Amendment right answer for the Supreme Court to enforce in sort of a bright line way. This is always going to be an area where there are constitutional trade-offs, particularly given that the Supreme Court knows nothing about politics. It has always been reluctant to get into what has been thought of as what has been called in previous Supreme Court opinions as the political thicket. Like, they don't understand it, they don't get it, and for them to go in sort of a ham-handed way will do a lot more harm than good. I mean, the original sin here is Buckley versus Vallejo, where the court said, look, it's fine to have limits on direct contributions, but independent expenditures, the sort of spending that's at issue in Citizens United, non-coordinated spending, poses less of a risk of corruption, so we're going to, call those limits unconstitutional. What you had as a result of that, at the level of, political, at the level of democratic policy, is you had money and power being pushed to the margins. You had money flowing to these outside loopholes and not to the candidates and to the parties. The candidates and the parties were bound by limits that these outside groups were not bound by. And you see, I think that part of the polarization of our current politics is due to the idea that it's much easier to send money to the fringes than it is to send money to the center. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which to achieve, there are all kinds of systems that can achieve political reform. How sympathetic the court is going to be to these various systems is quite another question. I mean, we've already had, just in the past few years, the Supreme Court kind of going around and picking targets. So you had them do independent expenditures, you had them do public financing, now you have them taking on contributions. And each time they're targeting one part of the system, and it's unclear what they're going to say we're just going to stay out of. I think the one thing that has shown some level of success has been public financing. I mean, you've had candidates be able to campaign very effectively on the platform that, look, I am not for sale. The money that I'm getting is coming from voters. It is not coming from these shadowy entities or these bizarre individuals. And so you've seen, for example, the Connecticut governor's race. The publicly financed candidate there was heavily outspent, both at the primary level and at the general election level, and still was able to prevail because he was able to tap into exactly that kind of messaging. Look, I'm not beholden to anyone but the voters. Money has marginal diminishing returns, and I think everyone realizes that. And you really saw a lot of that in this past election where, people were trying to throw more and more money at the same television slots in the same media markets in Ohio and Florida, and were paying just, absurd amounts of money for these particular TV spots. And the television audience in the meanwhile had been oversaturated with these things. So it's unclear how much marginal effect all of this vast spending had. Oh, not at all. I think that money has marginal diminishing returns, but there are a lot of markets out there to saturate. There's a lot of leverage that was unused in this past election. This past election, I'm unable to speak to the strategy of the Romney campaign with regard to super PAC spending. I felt like, you had a lot of conspicuous consumption spending in this last election, and just because some guy buys himself a Lamborghini doesn't mean he knows how to drive it necessarily. You just had a lot of these billionaires with their new political toys being like, oh, I'm going to take this for a drive. I bet I'm a brilliant political consultant, and I'm going to run these bizarre ads about communism with a tattered American flag flapping in the wind, and somehow I think that's going to be effective. Well, you're going to have this was the first presidential election after Citizens United. You had the conspicuous consumers, the early adopters. You had the people who were eager to run in there without the sort of beta testing of this whole super PAC thing having happened, and I think that you're going to see smarter, and I think you're going to see stealthier spending in the upcoming elections. Super PACs were for people who really wanted people to know how much money they were spending on the election. Corporations don't do that. Yeah, I think that the counter is in the grassroots, both in terms of grassroots fundraising and also in terms of just boots on the ground. The labor unions were able to be incredibly effective in this past election because they were able to do, in some ways, what they had always done, which is knock on doors, have phone backs, because the labor unions don't just have a treasury, they have actual people. Well, legislation takes place in a lot of different ways, and it's, I think that, legislators, of course, have their own political agendas. In some way, they're looking to their own political survival, but there's a way in which a kind of détente in terms of spending can be pitched to legislators in a way that makes them act, do the right thing, that makes them feel like their own interests are involved in doing the right thing. So I don't think of grassroots participation as opposed in any way to policymaking or to legislation. You see different kinds of policymaking, and it's, especially public financing, and its ability to incentivize and to increase grassroots participation. So, for example, in the New York City public financing system, after they instituted the multiple match, the percentage of people who gave to a politician increased by about, I think, threefold. And these were not large contributions. These were people giving $5, $10, in some cases more. But it just increased a level of participation and engagement so that people felt like they had bought a part of the campaign. And I think that model is now being considered in New York State. It's been considered a lot of other places. I don't think that a reform effort is going to start in Congress. I think it's going to start at a local level, and I think it's going to start in states. And, that's where we're focusing a lot of our efforts right now. It's interesting. You see less political polarization in the state legislatures and less party line voting than you do in Congress right now. And in the states that have public financing system, you have 70 or 80% support and voting for public financing systems, both among Republicans and Democratic legislators. You have, people who participate in the system really like it because it means that rather than spending their time in little boxes dialing for dollars, they are going to spaghetti dinners with their constituents, and that's what a lot of them got into politics to do.